Good morning, everybody, and thank you for attending our third workshop in the series of Universal Design for Learning in Higher Education. Today, we're going to be talking about facilitating discussion. My name is Charlotte Kurtz, and I'm the Learning and Applied Innovation Assistant Manager. And today, I'll be co-presenting with Dr. Stacy Dupfield, Office of Teaching and Learning Director, and then Dr. Lori Sweeney, an instructional designer on the Lake team. Lori, next slide, please.
Hi, I'm Lori. I'm going to talk a little bit about what our series is about. We are using the Universal Design for Learning strategies and looking at ways to achieve outcomes. In the strategies, we talk about three different areas that are the UDL guidelines: engagement, why we're learning, like how to recruit interest, how to motivate our students, helping them to understand why what the content we are teaching is important to them. Representation, that's the what of learning. How are you presenting it to the students? Is it just a straight lecture? Are there articles to read? Are they understanding what you are talking about? It's the content, the what of the learning. And then the last guideline is the action expression. And this is how they are learning. How are they showing to you that they are learning what you are showing them? Are they doing it by physical action? Is it in a lab? Are they showing you how they did an experiment? Are they writing a paper, or are you allowing video presentations? So you think about different ways. So today we will be talking about discussions that Charlie mentioned. We'll identify some strategies to help facilitating discussions using the UDL guidelines. We'll discuss some rubrics for assessment. We'll describe the qualities or examples of effective discussions. And we'll talk about discussion participation. So I would like to turn it over to Stacy for the next slide. Thanks, Stacy.
And so I'm going to talk just a little bit about the purpose of discussion and what a good discussion looks like before we jump into strategies. And so first of all, why would you want to do a discussion, right? So when a discussion is done well, it can actually have several positive outcomes listed here on this slide. It helps you to monitor if your students are learning what they're supposed to be learning. It helps you to further develop that understanding, that comprehension, and build their knowledge base. It can promote social interaction in the classroom, which also increases learning. It's a way to share knowledge and ideas. And it helps to promote critical thinking as students make inferences and weigh what they're hearing from their classmates. So true discussion. Often what happens is we put the label of discussion on a lot of different things that happen in our classrooms. If students are talking or if we're talking, we often will throw the label of discussion on it. But today we're going to be talking a little more formally about discussion. It's more than just conversation in the classroom. So true discussion that ensures the positive outcomes on the slide that we just looked at, needs to have the characteristics that are on this slide. The students need to be the main talkers. They need to be the ones that are sharing information. And in order to do that, they have to feel free to present their point of view. And so it has to be a safe classroom. Going into it, students need to know that they should be open to listening. They should be open to changing their mind when they receive more information about something. And one thing I found as an instructor is I'll often share examples with my students about times that I've changed my mind about something. And that happens a lot, right? As new information becomes available in our field, we change the way we do things. And I'll share examples of that with my students so they can see that I am paying attention, I'm listening, I'm seeking out information. And when I receive the evidence and it's overwhelming and it's showing me that there's a different way to think about something, that I do change my mind. The students should be speaking directly to one another and not just to you. Often we call discussion a question-answer session when the instructor's throwing out questions and students are providing answers. And the conversations really just between that student and the instructor, and the students aren't really talking to each other. But in a true discussion, the students are actually responding to one another. And in thinking about that, a way to facilitate that is to set up your classroom if possible so students can look at each other, because when you talk to someone, you look at them. And so if you can set your classroom up in a way, in a circle, or in a way that the students can see each other, that's going to more freely set up a situation where they're going to talk to one another. When you're having a discussion, you do more than just a word or two in response, like yes or no or sure. And so one thing that I found too is that it's really important to model for students and to tell them your expectation for a discussion, that a good response includes details. There's a rationale for your thinking. There's evidence to support your point of view. And so it really gets to that inferential and critical level of thinking, and show them what that looks like, and show them what it doesn't look like, because that can be really powerful too. You can have a little fun with that, maybe some humor, and show them what a really bad response looks like. But it tends to drive that point home. Okay, next slide. So now we're going to jump into the framework that Lori introduced you to, and what are some discussion challenges? So what you might be asking, what does a good discussion look like? Why is a discussion, why does it even matter? Like, why even have it? Why can't you just do a lecture or some other instructional approach? And then how to write good discussion questions or prompts. Okay, next slide. All right, so again, using our UDL framework of engagement, action, expression, and representation, let's think about a good discussion. So good discussions take upfront planning, and they can look different in different classrooms and in different situations, but there are some things that you should be aware of. You want to make sure that you're aware of the cultural norms in your classroom, especially if you've got students that didn't necessarily grow up in this area, or you didn't share the same background as your students. You can set some norms in your classroom and some expectations to make sure that you get off on the right foot and people understand what's okay and what's not okay in your classroom. You can start with small group discussions is a good way to start. Instead of, if you have a class of 20, 30 or more, you might want to just divide up into smaller groups where people feel more comfortable sharing, and start the thinking that way. With representation, I would recommend that you allow students to preview the content to make sure that they come into the class ready to share, allowing them time to prepare. Don't come in cold and expect them to participate because they aren't necessarily comfortable with the content yet. And provide that structure, like what will our discussion look like? I highly recommend, if you haven't done this yet, or you haven't spent some time really looking into how to facilitate discussions, there's actually a really good book called Discussion in a College Classroom by Howard, and it's a great foundation for getting started. In this book, Brookfield and Howard cites Brookfield and Preskel, and they identify some 15 benefits to discussion if it's done well. And I'm not going to read all 15 to you, but I think it's worth knowing that there are a few big ones that will I think propel you to want to do discussion in your classroom. For one thing, discussion increases attention, and we know that attention is the precursor to learning. It also introduces students to diverse perspectives that they don't always get if they're just listening to you as the instructor. And if it's facilitated well and you have those pre-established norms I just mentioned, it teaches students how to have a respectful discourse, which I think we all need as functioning adults in society. Next slide. Another challenge is getting students involved, right? I think that's probably a reason, if you've tried discussion in the past and have abandoned it, that you did abandon it, that you just couldn't get the students to get involved, that you maybe threw out a prompt or some sort of starter and everyone just looked at you. Or maybe you have that one student who's always just kind-hearted or likes to share what their ideas are, and they're the only ones who talk, and you don't get full involvement across the classroom. Or you have maybe an online class, and you have trouble getting the students to respond in a timely manner, and so at the end everyone throws a bunch of stuff up there just to meet the requirement for the grade, And what you don't get is a really good discourse, and you're pretty sure that nobody really even read what anybody else wrote. And so it was kind of a futile assignment. All right, next slide. So some ideas. I think that students should always know why. I used to teach high school students, and that was probably a question that I got 20 times a day. Why are we doing this? And so I always had to be on my toes and ready to answer it. And one thing I've told young teachers that I've mentored is, if you can't answer the question why, you need to rethink why you're doing this lesson. And so as college instructors too, we should always know why, and we should be able to answer that question. And even if our students are too respectful to ask, we should just present it. We should tell them why discussions are beneficial for learning. We should set clear expectations and show them and tell them what good participation looks like. What is it that we're expecting? And you should always ensure that your students are ready for the topic. Give them some reading, give them a video to watch, have a way for them to learn the content. And what I recommend too is to actually tell them that you're going to have a discussion based on the preparation that they're doing, and maybe even have them develop some of the questions and prompts that will drive the discussion. If it's something that you're going to start and they haven't been introduced to it yet, allow some thinking time after you've thrown a question or a prompt out, just so that you're not catching them cold or putting them in a hot seat. No one likes that. Think about how you feel yourself when you get put in that situation. And when that's done in the classroom, it really sort of adds up to a culture of distrust or stress. And you don't want students to feel that when they come to your classroom. There are some structures, some kind of ready-made discussion templates that you can use in your classroom, and we'll have those up on the website that you can link to. One I've used is called Rally Robin, where you put students in small groups. They get a letter A through whatever, A through D for the number of people you have in the group. They have some discussions and prompts they've either generated themselves or you've generated, and they have to go in order to respond. They can't go out of order. And then they take turns. So if A goes first one round, then B goes first the next round, et cetera. And what that does is it really takes care of those dominant talkers, and it takes care of the students who may not jump in. They have to, because it's their turn now to be first or to go next and to add on to the conversation. We'll put some more out there. I won't describe all of them, but there's some really some great ways you can get things started in your classroom if you just need a little bit of support getting started with silent discussion or challenge envelopes, all really good things that I've used in my own classroom with a lot of success. Finally, I strongly recommend assigning roles. It gives students an expectation for what it is that they need to accomplish. And it also keeps the conversation going and makes the discussion more meaningful. Without a role, a lot of times students will just sit silently and kind of flounder, or one person kind of takes over, and it defeats the purpose of the conversation or the discussion. All right. And turning it back over to Cher, I believe.
Okay, thank you. Next slide, Lori. Thank you. So some other challenges now when designing effective questions is what happens when your students don't understand the questions or they get off track. A lot of people say, I just have my students answering I agree or yes. So how do you get them to provide more of a discussion? And then applying those Bloom taxonomy of thinking skills and having the students do that in the discussion. So Lori, next slide, please. So again, following this UDL framework, engagement. So have your students practice discussion, teach your students how to write a question, maybe allow them an opportunity to come up with a question, like Stacy said, assigning roles. So maybe one week have a student actually come up with 2 questions for the readings or the chapters. If the students actually are writing the questions, they may know how to answer them and come up with good responses. So representation, remember, clear questions. Some examples of questions is to get the students to do more than just answer yes or no is, why is it important to? What is the meaning? How is this similar? Explain how. What is this meant by? Don't just allow that question for the response, yes or no. So think of that. Actual action and expression, reflection. So reflective learning, can aid learners in synthesizing new information, and it often is used to improve reading comprehension, writing performance, and self-esteem through that reflection. So allow them to ask why, after reading, how was this your response, or why, what would you do differently, etc. So allowing them to do that reflection is really important in the discussion. And now I'll turn it back over to Lori.
All right. I get the probably hardest challenge that we get from faculty, like how do I assess a discussion? Let's say everybody's in there discussing, but how do I give a grade? Am I going to grade it, or is it ungraded? How do we ensure participation if I'm not grading? How do we define a good response or a good post versus the yes or no, as Shar talked about? And then how do I track participation? So a lot of different challenges in assessment. So going back to the strategies and looking at the different areas with engagement, some of the suggestions would be to have your students be the leader or the facilitator of the discussion. It could be an in-classroom one or an online one. You can assign or volunteer depending on the level of your students. They're graduate students, they certainly are able to volunteer for the weeks that work the best for them for that. You may start out with undergraduates assigning so that the students can choose what they're going to be facilitating and understand what they're going to be doing. And as Shar mentioned, in creating the effective questions, have the students help create the questions and helping them to understand that they need to be aligned with the outcomes of why we're doing this discussion. It gets that engagement. We're just not creating a new question just because we want someone to discuss. It actually relates to the outcome of this activity or this weekly assignment. And this one is probably a hard one. Remember, there are many ways to be present and to participate. Not everyone writes 10 sentences as an answer. Others may write 2 sentences and be very clear about what they're explaining. We talk a lot about active listening, or actually active learning nowadays, but there is such a thing as the active listening and processing and reflecting in your own head, and maybe a little later doing the discussion. So think about that with engagement. Just because someone's not talking doesn't mean that they're not present and actively engaged. Representation, like how are you presenting this content so that they understand what's expected? Rubrics are really important with so many assignments, but especially with discussions. Having them help you, have the students help put the rubric together so they understand what each one of the categories mean. Maybe one of your categories in the rubric is professionalism. Many of our students don't understand what the word professionalism is. So you could help them in devising, did you meet that rubric? Is it medium, you're partly there, or did you unmeet that particular rubric? And your professionalism in your language gives some models of that. And the last section is about action expression. How do they respond? Like, how are you seeing they're doing well in these discussions? How are they expressing it? Are you allowing them options for audio, video? Maybe some of our students really have a hard time with writing and they need a little bit of a change up and feel more comfortable expressing what they're learning with audio or video. There are different tools we have available. The last bullet there, I've got down VoiceThread. It's been very popular. It gives students a choice of, you can give a text comment back, or you can give an audio comment, or you can do the full video showing your face. If you like a lot of hand motion to include in it. Another with the action expression is really helpful is the peer assessment. And going back to that beginning with engagement on the student leaders, if you, as a part of being a leader or facilitator for the week or 2 weeks for the discussion, assessment is a part of it, and having students respond to each student or several students, so many responses, and having your facilitator student help to bring it together and summarize in the end. They then get the concept of what's it like to lead a group, so that the next week when they're not leading, they have a different way of participating because they're understanding from a different level of what it was like to have to facilitate and do a little bit of assessment with the group. So lots of great ideas on how to assess. Of course, it's still a challenge, but these are some ideas to help our students get engaged and give them different ways to express what they're learning. So I get the last slide. No more handoffs. Everyone would like to say thank you to everyone from Stacy Duffield, Charlie Kurtz, and myself, Lori Swinney. We will take this video and have it posted on the website along with some of the resources, have some rubrics to give examples for the discussion and some roles, examples of roles you can use. So thank you for joining us.